Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So, carrying on with the TA-08 Pro build on the nice little Tamiya kit, or Tamiya, depending on how you pronounce it and where you're from. But yeah, looks like it's going to be a really fun build this, and hopefully it'll be a nice car to drive. But let's get you in for a close-up look and see how far we get with it on this one. I'll try and keep vid down to like 20-25 minutes. Because any longer than that it's a bit of a big ask to watch, but let's see how far we get. Right, so first thing it's asking us to do is build two of the tie rods up, and it does tell you to be careful. They've got a dot on one side, so you need to build two sets of these to 18.6 mil, and it's got a dot on one side of these what fasten onto your ball joint. And it does say in the instructions that you attach the little ball joint in to the side with the dot on it. Right, so next it's telling us to fasten the ball joints into the chassis with one of the little blue spacers underneath them. So quickly get one fastened in, and then the other one wherever it's hid. So we're going to fasten them into the chassis, so they'll go in there. Then when you fit the arms on, it's a bit weird how it tells you to build these up, but you've got little ridges on the tie rods, and it says have them both facing the same way. Right, so when we fasten these on, it's telling us you want the little ridge on the tie rod itself both facing the same way, and then the little dot facing down onto the ball joint. So that's one on, and then make sure this is facing the same way with the little dot and the ridge to that side, or to the right hand side as I'm looking down on it. And then we've got them in place. So let's see what we've got next. Right, so moving along. So we need the N2 parts, and you want it eccentric to the outside. So it looks like we've somehow got to squeeze these inside here. Looks like they're going pretty easy. So not sure if it'll show up on camera that easy, but the eccentric hole is towards the outside on both of them. Then we're going to slide on our suspension arms. Just be careful not to lose any of your little shims. Once you've got that in place, we're going to need the T11 and T10 part, and they're going to pop into position like that. Then we're going to have to flip the car over, and I've never seen this before, but for some reason it tells you to put a bit of grease on the end of these screws. Now I'm not entirely sure what that is for, but it tells you to do it in instructions, so I'm just following what it says. I don't know if it's to help it cut the threads in the T10 and T11 parts, but basically we just need to get all four of these screwed down, and then we'll be moving on to part 7. Right, so that's part 6 finished. We've got our turnbuckles, we've got the suspension arms, and that's what you should end up with when you look at it from bottom. So let's carry on and see what part 7's got in store for us. Alright, so moving along, we're going to need the T3 and T4 part. You're going to need 4 of the MB1 3x8mm screws, and we're going to need 4 washers. These are the 3mm washers out of B parts bag, and we're just going to drop all these on the top of the T-parts and just screw these down. And don't go overly crazy with the torquing these down, because you've only got tiny little machine threads and they're into plastic, and it's not the thickest plastic by the looks of this. So if you over tighten these, you're likely to split the little plastic part, and it's going to make a weak part on the vehicle. So if you have any harsh crashes, you're liable to rip these bits out. But this doesn't look a particularly taxing part, and they're quite easy to find, these washers, in the B parts. They're not in with the shims, they're actually the washers. So we'll get these screwed down and see what else we've got. Right, so moving along, we're going to need part A8 and an MB9. That's a ball race with a sort of a shim on back, or like a flanged one. Then we're going to need a normal bearing on this side. Then we're going to need to close it all up with a K3. So it looks like we've put that on in line with these two little lugs. Then we're going to need our spur gear, and I'm going to build this with the stock spur to start with. These are Mod 6 71 tooth, because we're not running a mega powerful motor in here. So next we're going to need to put the smaller of the shims, the thinner, and that just makes sure that that runs on the inner race and not the outer. Then we're going to need to build another of the pulleys, so let's get the parts for that. So now we're going to need to build another pulley up. So we're going to want one bearing in that side with the little flare on bottom, then a normal bearing, then we're going to close it up using one of these parts. Then we're going to get that into position. And lock that into your spur. Then we're going to need one of the slightly thicker spacers. This is the MB12. So we're going to position that over it. Then you're going to want one of the MB2 screws. Just make sure your spacers sat flush. Then we're going to need to screw all this together. So then you can get the supplied spanner and tighten it down. Then you should have your pulley assemblies. So it looks like they're going to run on the inside to keep us belt off as spur gear. But you should have your pulley assembly with its bearings all built up. So let's see what else we've got. Right, so moving along to step 9. We're going to be assembling the motor plate with our spur gear and everything. So once you get the notch lined up, you then want an MB2 screw, and this is a 3x6mm. So we're going to attach that to the motor plate. Make sure your little shims or belt guides are to the inside. Then we're going to want one MA1, so this is a 3x10mm. You're then going to want one of the tiny little shims. Then we're going to want one of the small bearings with the flange on bottom. Then a tiny little shim. Then we're going to want the MB13 spacer, and these shims are the 3mm by 5mm by 0.1. Then we're going to attach this to the motor plate, and I believe this is going to make the guide foot belt, so the belt should run on the skirted washer. Then we're going to need our chassis back, and then basically this, I believe, is going to sit somewhere in here. I think it sits just on the outside in that recess. So we're going to need his belts now. So let's get both of them. Right, so we're going to want the shorter of the two belts to the front, and that goes to the inside. Make sure you've got your belt guide to the spur, and you want this over the top. And then the longer of the belts is going to be your rear belt. So again, just make sure you've got the guide for the belt against the spur gear. Now we're going to sit that into position, and then we're going to need 2 of the MB1 screws. They're 3x8mm, and then on these you're going to want a spring washer, and then we're going to want a normal washer. It's probably going to be easier if you've got a sort of a ball head hex driver for these, because it's a bit of an angle. So we've got to try and get these through into the motor mount, which is going to be easier said than done, especially with the belts flying around everywhere. So I would get one in, and then we can build the other screw up with the spring washer and then its ordinary washer, and then try and get the front one into position as well. Definitely easy with the ball headed bit. So we've got his belts into position. Make sure your guides for your belt are against the spur. And that's what you should end up with. So let's crack on and see what section 10's got in offer for us. Right, so moving on to section 10, and this is quite literally Tamiya taking half the RC industry to school. We've got proper shims, mainly these ones that sit in front of the bearings that HB Racing forgot on the D2 Evo. And we've got even shims behind the actual planetary gears. So yeah, congratulations Tamiya, at least you know how to build a diff. Don't be concerned about these not being bearings. The idea on a touring car is not to be diffing out, so they don't need to be bearings. But basically, we're going to get one of these, and I think just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to put a little bit of graphite grease on these. So I'm just going to have a little bit of graphite grease on them. Then we're going to pop that into the diff housing. And then I'm going to use some bearing grease on these. I find it just stops you chewing bearings up, and it makes them less likely to leak. So we get that sat down. Once you've got that in place, we're then going to put the little shim that keeps us gap and keeps us O-ring safe. Then on top of that, we're going to have a 5.5 by 7 by 0.2 mil shim. So we'll get that into place. Then the lovely task of trying to get a pin in a diff. And these are always fiddly no matter how you try. So basically all we're trying to do is find the hole in the diff and get the pin to keep everything in place. And this is what's going to be driving your actual gear. And you just want to slide that through. This is where we get covered in it. So once you've got that in place, we're then going to get one of our gears, and you want to make sure you've cleaned the ends off where you remove it from the parts tree. So we get that into position. Then you're going to want one of your gaskets, and we're going to get that sat in there. So that's one part complete. And that side is always easier than building this one, because it's pretty fiddly to get down into the bottom of it. So once we've got his O-ring in place, we then need his shim that protects his little O-ring. Then we need a spacer shim. Then we have the lovely task of trying to get his pin into position. And up to now I've not found any easy way of doing this other than tweezers or snap nose pliers, and then trying to sort of coax it into position. But you do have a slot at either side, so if you get your hole lined up with that, you can kind of get the pin into position and then slide it across. But it's a fiddly thing, and it's just one of them that take time. So if you line it up with the two slots, you can get it through. Once we've got that into place, we're going to drop that gear in. And if you just spin the output shaft, it'll drop into position. So once we've got all that together and covered in plenty of gunk, you can then get your cross gear, and we're going to pop on our little gears. And then on the back of each one of these, thank you very much for this Tamiya, we're going to want the tiny little shims just to make sure that his gears aren't going to try and separate. And it helps to have a bit of grease on your fingers when you're doing this, because your little shims will stick to them. But basically, just make sure none of them like that are trying to escape. Once you've got them all into position, then we just need to lower the entire thing in. But once they sat down, just a quick glance around, make sure all your shims are there, and should have a smooth operating gear set in your diff. Now we need to build another up exactly the same as that before we start filling them and moving on to what shims we put on the outside. So I'll get the next one built up and see where we go from there. Right, so once we've got both diffs done, you're going to get the clear fluid, and we're going to put this one in the front. So this is the much thicker of the two fluids. I like to try and get some to go down back of the gears, which is easier said than done with this really thick stuff. But you want to fill these up just over the cross member in the middle. Should be a lot easier with the rear, with this one being a lot thinner. So this is the orange or more orange fluid of the two. And with these you can just spin the gears around slightly. You might have to hold them down in the middle just to stop the internal gears lifting up, but you do get plenty diff grease to do them both. And we can just leave these to settle and then you can top them back up. So I'd just like to slowly work the diff round, and then just make sure you push your gears back down. It takes a few hands to do this, but you can slowly work the diff round and work the diff grease in. You just need to make sure they push down, and then you want to leave these so they completely settle, and then you can top them off. But let's leave them to settle in, and then I'll show you how to close them up. And there is slight differences in how we're building the front and rear up, so remember which is your front and which is your rear. And if it helps, put the coloured fluid near the one that you're doing. So let's give them a chance to settle, top them off, and then we'll carry on. Right, so once we've got as diffs filled and as fluid settled, you just need to close these up. And if you got the fluid levels right, you shouldn't end up with too much diff fluid coming out. So the next thing we're going to want to do, we're going to need a 1.5mm driver, and we're going to carefully work all 8 of these screws into as diff housings. Just be very careful when you're tightening these down. Quite small screws and really fine threads. So you don't want to be cross-threading these or over-tightening them. And for me, one thing that I find useful on these, especially if you're going to be stripping the RC down to service and things like that, is I've marked a little R and a little F on the actual diff housings themselves. And that way you can quickly identify which is your front and rear diff. The other way to very quickly identify which is front and rear, your front one on a touring car is always way stiffer than your rear one. So if you just grab the output shafts and spin them, you should be able to feel which is far stiffer. I think the stock fluids, if I just check, is a 10,000 I believe in front and 3,000 rear. So there should be quite a noticeable difference with how stiff the front one is. But if you just work your way around nice and gently, should have, although it's stiff, really smooth operation, so you know that you've not got any of the little lugs off the tree still on your gears. And with the diffs, I just like to start all the screws off so you know everything's lined up, and then just kind of tighten them up in a cross pattern. And it just means if you've got any air or excess fluid in your diffs, it can work its way out, and you know you've got a nice seal on your gasket and you're not just pinching it from one side. So I'll sort of tighten that one down mostly, then I'll tighten this one down just till it starts to bite, and then switch to one of the opposite sides. And it's far easier screwing these together if you've got a proper driver. The supplied Allen keys will do the trick, but it's not going to be very friendly on your fingers. And holding these diffs is definitely a bit more vicious than holding a geared diff, because the belt guides try and bite your fingers. But you should end up with a really nice operating diff and no leaks. So I think that one is going to make this video long enough. So we've gone from step number 6 all the way through to step 10. I believe the only thing we've got to do now is the next thing will be deciding or placing the certain shims and the housings on them. But I think this video has been long enough, so let's wrap this one up. There we have it, parts I believe 6 to around 10, and it's slowly starting to take shape. I'm trying to not make these videos too long, kind of makes them easier to follow along if you're doing the build. But we've got belts and we've got diffs built, so it's kind of starting to look a bit more like a car now. But thanks again for watching Wtf Rc Cars. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, share to friends and family, and hopefully see you guys again in the next one.